Welcome. I'm Jeannie Fromer. I'm a professor of intellectual property law and vice dean for intellectual life here at the law school. I wanted to welcome you to Respectfully Dissent, which is a new series here at the law school where you get to experience your own professors debating the most important current legal and policy issues. Today's event is about corporate social responsibility, and more on that in a moment. Our next event in October, which you'll get more information about soon, is going to be between Sam Zakharoff and Jeremy Waldron on judicial review, Congress versus courts, who should be supreme. But a little background on this series. For those of you that aren't yet steeped in US Supreme Court decision after Supreme Court decision, since the mid-1900s, US Supreme Court justices, and often state Supreme Court justices too, regularly began ending their dissenting opinions with "I respectfully dissent." It was a way of disagreeing, they're writing a dissent after all, while also communicating to their colleagues and the public that while there might be a sharp disagreement on legal issues, they retain respect and cordiality to their colleagues on the other side of the issue. And it's in that spirit that we're inaugurating this Respectfully Dissent series. Your law professors here and the other ones you will see featured sometimes have sharp, substantive disagreements with each other, but we also really like and respect each other and value having discussions with each other, but can also walk away as friends. We'll see what happens at the end of this. But I have good hope. And we also sometimes, we learn and we're sometimes persuaded by each other. We don't always walk out with the same opinions we walked in with. So we can be on opposite sides of the V and supportive colleagues at the same time. So thank you for gathering today to engage on the topic of corporate social responsibility, and I'm delighted to have two of my brilliant and wonderful colleagues here today to discuss the topic. We've got Deborah Burand, who's professor of clinical law, and she directs the International Transactions Clinic. She also co-directs the Grunin Center for Law and Social Entrepreneurship. And Marcel Kahan, who's the George T. Lowy Professor of Law, teaching corporations and other related courses. There are many more fascinating aspects to each of their biographies, which I have no doubt some of which will emerge during the discussion, but I want to turn to the discussion. So I will leave it at that. I'm going to loosely moderate a discussion here, and we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. So, to start out, I just wanted to ask you each why you think that this is an important issue in today's time, whether it's intellectually, practically, as a human being. So Deborah, why don't we start with you?
Oh, thank you very much, and so good to see all of you. I was just telling Marcel that I put some of this on social media last night that we're going to do this, and I got inundated by his former students and friends and colleagues, and I'm like, where are my people? But I see some of you in the audience, so be kind. I think it's really fitting that we have this conversation today where we're taking stock of the power, the societal power and purpose of corporations. Just up the road, the UN is having its General Assembly meetings, and they're paying attention to the fact that the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals are not going all so well. Those are to be in place and reached by 2030. We're a little past the midpoint, and the news is not good. In about a third of those target areas, we see no progress at all or backsliding. And so this leads me to why I'm really interested about talking about this today with Marcel, which is what should we expect of corporations as our world faces growing societal and environmental challenges. And I'm going to step out of my box for a second and ask you two questions. Show of hands if you feel safe doing this. How many in the audience think that we can address the world's most pressing challenges without any corporate involvement. How many in the audience think that corporations have to be involved if we are to be successful in responding to these challenges? That's why we're here. That's why we're here, right? I want to say a few personal things, if I could, before I hand it over to Marcel. Yeah, I like to read former Chief Justice Leo Strine's work. He was the Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court, and Delaware law often gives us some guidance on what corporations can and cannot do. And I found an article that he wrote quite a while ago that was entitled, "Corporate Power is Corporate Purpose, Evidence from My Hometown." And that actually got me thinking. He tells the story about the forces that were at play when DuPont departed from his hometown of Wilmington, Delaware. So here's my hometown story, because I've been shaped by what happened in my hometown, Anderson, Indiana, when General Motors abruptly closed its factories there. It was a booming town when my family moved there in 1969. It made all the electric parts for General Motor cars. It had the highest ratio of electrical engineers per person in the country. We had over 20 General Motor plants in our town. Our rush hours, because we often ran 24/7 with the plants, was whenever the shifts changed. So that meant we had 7 o'clock rush hour in the morning, 3 p.m. rush hour in the afternoon, 11 p.m. rush hour at night, and then we do it all over again. Out of a population of when we moved there of about 70,000, General Motors employed 25,000. And then there were all sorts of auto-related companies that were providing parts to these plants. Well, in 1980, when I graduated from college, that story changed abruptly, and GM shuttered all 20 of the plants. At that point, Anderson had the highest rate of unemployment in the nation. Teddy Kennedy, who was starting a presidential run, came to Anderson, as all political candidates do. They circle around wherever the tragedies are going. And he then talked about what he saw in Anderson at his speech at the Democratic National Convention in New York, and it was entitled, "The Dream Will Never Die." And I quote him, "I have seen the closed factories and the stalled assembly lines of Anderson, Indiana, and Southgate, California, and I've seen too many, far too many idle men and women desperate to work." But the story doesn't end there. It never ends there. Today, nearly 45 years later, this is what I see when I go home to visit my father. The population is now down to 52,000 from 72,000. Nearly 22% of that population lives below the poverty line. That means 1 in 4. 1 in 10 lives on less than $10,000 a year. The crime rate is 82% higher than the national average. Substance abuse is skyrocketing. Meth labs proliferate. Some call my hometown the meth capital of the Midwest. And only 16% of the adults who live there have been able to reach a bachelor's degree. The last GM employee's job at Anderson is to make sure the unused plants are boarded up. Now, can I blame General Motors for all of these woes today? No. But the fact of its departure, the way it departed, with so little regard for its employees and the community that had hosted it for decades, clearly kicked off a decline from which my hometown has yet to recover. So I go back to Strine, and I think why we're here today. What happens when corporate boards like that of DuPont or General Motors are faced with the reality that shareholder interests sometimes are in deep conflict with the interest of other constituencies where they operate? What do you think, Marcel? Can you tell I'm a little mad about it? And yes, I've never bought a GM car. I hold grudges.
Nor did I. I like your last question. And I want to say that we live in a very difficult times where we are facing a lot of problems. And there is no political consensus on how we should address these problems. And a lot of people are looking to corporations to solve the problems of society. that we don't seem to be able to solve in other ways. And I think this is fundamentally misguided. Corporations are not going to be effective in doing that, and they are not being set up to do that. We need to solve the problems that we have through legislation and through regulation. And the reason why we are not able to adopt this legislation and the regulation is because we, not we in this room, but we in America, do not necessarily have a consensus on how these problems should be solved. So in the absence of a political consensus, looking to corporations to do what you in the room may think is the right thing to do, but people outside the room disagree about, is not going to be working. So your question was, should GM be permitted or required, either one, to do things that are in the best interest of the shareholders, but is not against, but it runs against the interest of other people in society. So in economics, we call this an externality. And the normal answer to the question is, well, if we have laws and regulations that say that in some instances, we cannot do things that are good for us and that violates the rights of others. And in that case, corporations are obligated, like everybody else, to follow the law. But if there is no law that says you can't do that, then you can pursue your own interest. You are legally permitted to pursue your own interest. So the answer to the problem that you have is that we should have, or maybe the answer is, that we should have laws against plant closings. Now, of course, economists will tell you stories much more complicated, and that we need to grease the wheels of the market, and sometimes people get displaced in the process. That's too bad, but that's in the interest of the larger good. And I'm not addressing, we may not agree on that issue, but I'm not addressing that issue. The way to address the issue is through the political system. And just another thing, and then I'll hand it back to Jeannie for the next question. We talk about corporations, but corporations, that's the first thing that I tell students when I teach the class. Corporations are artificial legal entity. There is you can't touch a corporation. A corporation doesn't think. A corporation has no feelings. A corporation has no utilities. Corporations are stand-in. In the back of the corporation are human beings. And these human beings are, like for simplicity now, you can say it's the shareholders who own the corporation, or it's the directors who run the corporation. Corporate law is mostly concerned about the conflicts of interest between directors and shareholders. So when you order, if you issue an order to a corporation that says, do the right thing, be more socially responsible, even if it's bad for shareholders, and even if it's not required by the law. What comes to my mind as a corporate scholar is that you're empowering the people who run the corporations, and these are among the most powerful people in the world, right? The people who run the top 100 corporations. We both agree among the most powerful people in the world. If you remove the constraint for them and say, you can do whatever you think is right, they are not going to do what you think is good. They are going to do what's good for them. And that's a big worry that I'm having when I hear like, well, let's give more discretion to boards. People already have plenty of discretion to deviate from profit maximization in the long run, in the short run, in whatever run. And if you increase the discretion, they will do more things that are good for them. Nobody forced the board of GM to close the factory in your hometown. That was not something that they were afraid of legal liability. That was their decision for whatever reasons they made it. And the reasons mostly it was their own self-interest.
I'm ready to jump in, but if you want to ask a question, go right ahead.
Well, let me just get, hold that thought, and maybe it'll fold
Okay.
into the next thing, because I just want to take a step back for a second and ask each of you, what is this that we're talking about today? How would you frame the issue? Because I think you might have different framings of this, or similar overlapping framings, and it would be useful to lay that out, and then would love to hear your thoughts and reactions.
Is it,
Go ahead.
no, is this being corporate social responsibility? Is that?
Yeah, how would you frame this of what we are discussing today? How would you understand corporate social responsibility? Do you want to use a different term?
I'll
So
leave
I
it to
think we are,
Deborah to
I think we
answer
are
that
framing
first.
it differently. So this is why I respect this man, but don't always agree with him. I hear everything you're saying, Marcel, but I also think that that means that we won't see the kind of action that we need to start seeing in the world. It'll be more of the same because of the things you've already raised, which is there's not a political consensus always on some of these, and the ability of state and federal legislators to move in these directions. We see all sorts of ESG, anti-ESG, woke versus woke. We're all over the board right now. So what I am thinking about, and it's why I'm not quite ready to let go of the conversation about the power systems that are in place that put the shareholders, I'm in agreement with you, particularly in Delaware, but other places as well, shareholder primacy is something that is part of Delaware law. And that system, that power system that basically says it's set up to make sure that the shareholders always win. They're the only constituents that have the power to elect a board member. So the boards respond first and foremost to those shareholders. And other constituents are of secondary importance, if that. I think that's the way the world is. I don't think that's the way it has to be. And so one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, and I see evidence of some movement in this space, which really starts to say, yes, would be great if there were laws that said, hey, when you leave a town, you got to leave it better than the way you came in. I think Eisenhower said that about how you walk out of any kind of situation. But we've seen some re-examination of the purpose of corporation in recent years, and I think we should lean into that and explore it. I know you're not a big fan of the 2019 Corporate Roundtable Restatement of Purpose. You may say, oh, yes, you are a fan, but I'm not sure that you are. But it did embrace this idea of stakeholder capitalism. That is capitalism that is driven by the mutually beneficial relationships between companies, their employees, their customers, their suppliers, and their communities. And the question I think some of us have looked at on that is this a sea change in how businesses do business, or is it just business as usual with some kind of a pandering gloss? And I think there can be arguments made on both sides. But that's not the only thing that's been happening. Larry Fink has said the relationship between companies, employees, and society is being redefined. And we have seen changes in how shareholder proxy votes are going forward, engagement with shareholders at perhaps a different level. Again, one can say, is it checking the box or is it true engagement? But I think we can start to say that when we talk even under Delaware's fiduciary duty, which is of directors, which is to maximize the long-term value of corporations for the benefit of shareholders, you can read that more expansively than we sometimes do. I do not think it is purely to maximize short-term profits, unless you're in a Revlon sale of a business situation. But one can take that language and say, okay, maximizing the long-term value of the corporation for the benefit of the shareholders does mean engaging with and responding to the needs and the demands and the interests of these constituents. And corporations are starting, some of them are starting to be more responsive to that.
So there is a lot there. I don't think anybody disagrees that corporations have can look at the time frame over which they want to maximize shareholder profits or pursue the economic interest of shareholders, which is really a better statement. And while Delaware subscribes to shareholder primacy, there are about 20 to 30 states that do not. And I will challenge you to see whether the states that are incorporated, the corporations that are incorporated in the 20 to 30 states that have a different law than Delaware, act any differently. And I very much doubt that you will find any evidence. So my reaction to what you are saying is that you are placing way more weight on the legal regime than I do. While the legal regime is, as you describe, it is not the legal regime that determines how corporations act in this regard. And the Business Roundtable 2019 statement, and I'm happy you mentioned that, is that the Business Roundtable, I think about 25 years ago, said shareholder primacy is the norm. We are there in order to pursue shareholders' interest. And a few years ago, they changed around and said, actually, it is more of a stakeholder interest. So a lot of these companies were incorporated in Delaware. None of them were sued. That shows that there is no problem, really, from the perspective of Delaware to make these pronouncements. Secondly, I was at a conference where people were asked, how many of these CEOs who signed that statement consulted with the board of directors? And the answer was none. None of them did. So is this a real meaningful change, or is it just some pious pronouncements? I am very much on the camp of pious pronouncements. I don't think these statements changed any actions that the corporation did. I think it's futile politically to push companies to sign these statements. What we should do, if you want to have change, the change must happen through laws and through regulations. Who is one of the biggest proponents of stakeholder-oriented capitalism? One of the biggest proponents, if I may say so in this room, is our own graduate, Marty Lipton. What is Marty Lipton known for? Who are his clients? They are the CEOs of corporate America. I hope I don't do any injustice to Marty Lipton, but Marty Lipton is a very good lawyer. You become a very good and very successful lawyer if you make your clients happy. It is the CEOs who like stakeholderism because it decreases accountability to them. CEOs right now have the power to do all the good things that they want to do. They can do it all. You don't need a change in the legal rules in order for them to do that. So the real change happens through the political system. The real change will happen either if we pass laws and regulations that force companies to do what we want them to do, or if we make it more profitable for corporations to do that. If you want corporations to behave in a socially responsible manner, don't buy products from corporations that do not engage in a socially responsible manner. Then you will provide incentives for corporations to act in the way you want them to act. You're right. If we do nothing, it will be business as usual. I completely agree with you on that front. What I disagree with you is that if we are pushing for corporate social responsibility, I don't think we are going to see any meaningful change. I think our activism is going to be directed into channels that are not productive. That's different. I know you work a lot on impact investment, and impact investment is very, very different from that. There, we take money and put it to uses that we think are desirable uses. That's effective, right? That means something. Having corporations to make pronouncements of one sort or another, that's not effective. That doesn't produce any real change.
I'm willing, later, I want to stay on this for a little bit longer. I'm willing later to talk about the other factors that might shape corporate behavior, because I think we both may be in more agreement on that area. But I want to stick to this issue for a little bit longer, if you don't mind. Yes, corporations can do a lot just in this idea of maximizing their own value as they move forward, not just short-term profit maximization. And they may not be fully exercising all that they could do under that. So I'm very interested in thinking about what we can do to help shareholders shape that. Because what we all know is that the shareholders that are getting in front of the companies are often not human beings. They are the institutions that are voting on behalf of the shareholders. So we've got this disconnect. So when I think about how we shift the power dynamic here, I am thinking about how do we let your voices, your decisions, your concerns get in front of these boards. You are shareholders. You should have more rights. I like the fact that the SEC is opening the doors and allowing more shareholder proposals to actually have to be engaged. Yes, they're not moving, and a lot of the corporations are saying no to them, but I do think that that is a real, that's almost a it's a little bit more democratic than it's been in the past.
Yeah, but I think you're suffering, I'm sorry, I think you're suffering from an illusion. We live, where do we live? We live in the United States of America. Who are the presidential candidates? You know who they are? Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. What are the forecasts for the election? It's going to be a close election. You, in this room, I don't think it would be a close election in this room. But in the country, it is a close election. The shareholders are not you. The shareholders are the citizens of the United States. If the people in the United States are closely divided, that will be true for shareholders as well. If we are looking for shareholder democracy, if we are saying let shareholders decide whether to sacrifice profits in order to achieve some other goals, like more environmental protection, that's, I know from having talked to you in the past, that's what your idea is. You are very convinced that the shareholders will decide one way. My question to you is, if you're so convinced that shareholders will sacrifice their own profits, how do you explain the fact that the political poll shows that the election is going to be a close election? I think we believe that the other shareholders who are out there are going to agree with us, but I don't think that's true. The shareholders are much, much more diverse than you imagine. So when you tell shareholders, you get to decide what the corporation is doing. Corporation may not be not doing the things that you think are good. Corporations may be doing things that you affirmatively think they are bad. They are going to sacrifice your profits in order to achieve a social aim that you disagree with. That's also a possibility that you have to take into account.
So I would also say that I don't think I live in a bubble. Okay?
I do.
I know you do.
And you do too.
I don't think you should be speaking on behalf of other people. Isn't that what we're talking about right now?
Touché.
Thank you, Marcel. I will be respectful, as I say. No, but I think this is the issue. We sit here as shareholders. We also sit here as potential employees, as consumers of the products. We have multiple ways to communicate with corporations about what we think they should be doing and what is in their long-term interest as well as ours. And so I'm not quite ready to say we're polarized, we won't come up. I think, as you see, there are companies now that are reporting at levels that are not required of by any regulator. The SEC is having a hard time getting some of its rules and disclosure requirements out there in a way that works. And companies are going ahead and they are disclosing anyhow. They're reporting anyhow. So why are they doing that? Because they know it's in their long-term interest, and they've been communicating with the people they want to hire, the people they want to sell their products to, the communities where they're living, and they're saying, you know what? If we want to succeed and we want to build value in the long term for our company, we have to do this. So I think there's room, more room than you see. I also think, and this is
Can I interrupt
no,
you
please
here?
go right ahead.
Things that I completely agree with you, and you did speak for me. I think our power as employees and our power as consumers is over to induce companies to do what we want them to do is much, much higher than our power as shareholders. We're completely in agreement about that.
But I'm not willing to let go of one of the tools in my toolbox,
Okay.
particularly in places where they say shareholder primacy is important. And I think the stakes are too high for us not to use every tool that we have. Now, one of the places where you and I think, have also had some disagreement, or maybe not strong disagreement, but I am very interested in what the Delaware courts have said about supporting private ordering. And when I say private ordering, what I'm talking about is, in Delaware, the ability to put a constraint on directors, not just, as Marcel said, let them do anything they want. No, putting constraints on directors, redefining the fiduciary responsibilities by having a more limited purpose to the corporation than just doing anything you want to do, so long as it's not contrary to public policy. And we see, not many, but again, I'm looking to see where there's room. We're seeing some companies starting to do that, incorporating a C Corps in Delaware and putting in a more limited purpose that makes it very clear what they think their societal role is, and the interests, the constituent interests that they also want to represent. And then they're able to get even more room to move in that direction. Or, and this is, I think I've seen at least one person in here. I've got a group of students every year who are Tepper Fellows. Tepper Fellows, one of my students, yes, but Tepper Fellows, and they report on the state of social enterprise and the law in the United States. And as some of you may know, there's specialized legal forms that are being set up all over the United States, even in anti-ESG states. Now, I think part of that is a timing issue. The new legislation went in, and then the anti-ESG movement came about, and no one's connected the two, so let's not tell them that. But what we're seeing is these new specialized forms, and I'm particularly interested in the benefit corporation form. There are 41 states in the United States now that said, you can do this. You can incorporate, and you can say what you want to do to support constituents beyond your shareholders. Even make those as primary or even more important than your shareholders. And I think there's interesting room for this to play in. I personally tend to like better the idea of people putting it into a C Corp and then putting their own charter documents together, an incorporation, partly because the benefit corporation is so untested. The rules are different from every state to every state. If you're in Ohio, you cannot be a benefit corporation if you want to go public. You have to stay privately held. In some states, there's all sorts of reporting requirements. In other states, there's none. There's a lot of legal uncertainty about that legal form. There's not uncertainty about the C Corp legal form. And so I have seen some of, and I agree, this is one place where my impact investing, social entrepreneurial focus maybe makes some of these things more obvious to me, but perhaps, and I'm channeling you, but they're small, Deborah, they're small. Yes, but it's happening. And I see more and more of our clients going in, choosing to be a C Corp, putting a specialized purpose there, putting everyone on notice. This is what we're about.
So now we don't disagree. I mean, I'm all in favor of alternative structures where corporations can do things other than to maximize or pursue the economic interest of the shareholders. If shareholders want to invest in a corporation, that's great. That's fantastic. Whether they need to have alternative entities, or they can be regular corporations with what you call C Corps, that's just a regular corporation for students not familiar with the tax laws. That's a detail, right? I'm completely flexible about that. The question, and you did channel me, the question is, how is this going to solve the problems that we are having? And I don't think it will. It will solve the problems like to a very, very small extent. And it's wonderful. And corporations do that. We are all on the same page about it. Sure, a corporation that says is that we care about two things, profits and the environment. So we will sacrifice profits for the sake of the environment up to some level, or up to the level that the board of directors decide. You want to give money to a corporation like that? Wonderful. You'll make less money, you'll do good things for the environment, perfect. But we don't see a lot of that happening. Now, are we going to see more of that happening in the future? My bet is yes, we are going to see more of that happening in the future. Is that going to become a predominant way, or will these corporations account for 10% of the capitalization of publicly traded corporations in the United States by the year 2050? My prediction is no. If I'm wrong, that would be great, but my prediction is no. That is not an issue where we disagree with at all.
It's an issue of scale.
It's an issue of scale. We are in favor it should be done. We have different predictions of how much will be done in the future. But clearly it should be done, and it's fine.
And it's an important place for legal scholarship.
And
I think.
Does it matter whether 41 states or all 50 states plus DC permits this form? No, it doesn't matter, because it is, as long as one state permits it, you can incorporate in that state and do whatever you want. As long as we have one avenue for doing this, 41, 50, not relevant. Does it show political support that we have 41 states? Yes, it does. But for somebody who really wants to have a real effect, 41, 42, 43 doesn't matter. Should we put our political energies to get the states that don't have it to adopt a law? I would say probably not, because it has no legal effect. But,
I agree for a different reason.
But is it kind of like a nice thing if it were to happen without much effort? Yes, it would be a nice thing if it were to happen without much effort.
So, to be honest, as I've said, I'm not a big fan of the benefit corporation. I think you can do it, get the same place, maybe a better place, just going under a traditional form and putting it into your articles.
And I think that's permitted.
And it is permitted, and
Yeah.
it's happening. We did it in Michigan, in my clinic. Michigan told us when they first saw us put all these things in, Dodge v. Ford. It was a great place to test it. And they said, what are you doing here? And they called us up and said, we're going to turn down your application where you put all these really interesting benefits, social goals into your charter. And we said, well, we'll be really, really interested in hearing why you're turning us down, because like Delaware, anything's allowed so long as it is not contrary to the public policy of Michigan. And we're willing to sue.
And can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why did you not form an LLC?
They were an LLC. They were an LLC, and they could not get the capital they wanted. They had investors saying, we would prefer you to be a corporation. We want you to get out of that LLC status. And in Michigan, there was no benefit corporation legislation. They wanted to be in Michigan because it was a bunch of Michigan female engineers, and they really wanted to boost that economy and show that they were committed to it. All of which is to say, after we had that conversation at the Secretary of State's office and they found out that we were willing to sue, all of a sudden they said yes. It was the best result possible. They saw it, they thought about it, and then they said yes. And I'm like, why did we even waste our time trying to put together a benefit corporation? We could do this without it. All of which is to say, there's another thing going on here. So I'm just going to, now we can maybe move, if you want, into other factors that could touch us. There are, and I have mixed views about this one, there are municipalities and states starting to look at how these corporations are formed, legal form, what's in their charters, and they're starting to use their procurement rules to say, I like what you're doing. I'm going to put my thumb on the scale and let you get more contracts from me, better financing from me. And that is also something that will have an impact on corporations. It's not like each corporation sits there and they only see the world, talk about a bubble that they're in. They're seeing what their competitors are. There are companies that are literally pushing themselves into these spaces because they think it'll give them a competitive advantage against those corporations that are paying no heed.
Now you have turned around to me because
I know, I told you I was going to get there.
I thought it's a political process. We have to use the political process.
It's
so
one of the
getting
political
municipalities to privilege public benefit corporations over other corporations, or to say you get an advantage in contracting if you have a good environmental record, or if you treat your employees nice, or like, and as you know, many in New York City and in many other municipalities, in order to get city contracting, you have to pay prevailing wage. So that is an example of the political process saying to business entities, and it's not corporations, right? It is a corporation, it's an LLC, it's a partnership, it's a sole proprietorship, right? I don't think we should have different rules depending on how exactly you organize yourself. I think if we want business entities to act in a certain way towards their employees, towards the environment, these rules should apply regardless of the business entity is a corporation, LLC, an LP. You know, I'm doing a lot of like word salad here, which you don't know. It doesn't matter. Like if you're an employer, you should have the same obligations to your employees regardless of whether you're a corporation or an individual. It may depend on how many employees you have, but not on whether you're an individual or corporation. So that's the political process doing its work.
Could I interject for a minute, because I want to get us back and make sure we get to cover how do we figure out what's in the best interest of the shareholder? So if we get back to the traditional corporation, and we're in Delaware, shareholder primacy, how do we figure out what's in the best interest of the shareholders? Who speaks for the shareholder? I know you might want to talk about the recent Meta decision in that regard.
Well, that's a problem, right? Because we are not really trying to do a very good job in figuring out what's in the best interest of the shareholders. But we have people who are in theory elected, that's the board of directors, but in practice function as a self-perpetuating board that is rarely challenged by anybody else. And as long as their decision is not either in their personal interest, where they have a personal financial conflict, or is so evidently irrational that it's clearly not in the interest of the shareholders. As long as neither of these two things is true, they basically get to determine what's the best interest of the shareholders. So the people who run the corporation, the powerful people I talked about before, they have huge amounts of discretion to determine what's in the best interest of shareholders. And if we said, well, you don't really have to do what's in the best interest of the shareholders, you can do what's either in the best interest of the shareholders, or what's in the best interest of employees, or what's in the best interest of the communities where our plants are located, then this discretion that's already very, very big gets even wider. But we are not doing a very good job. And nobody really knows what's in the best interest of the shareholders.
So I think I agree. But I think, again, I am looking for tools. I'm not willing to say, okay, can't do it. I think that there are things that could be done to help those that are asset managers be in a position where they have a better sense of what the shareholders whose money they represent and that they're voting, more accountability for them. And I agree it's messy. Democracy is messy. If we wanted everyone to vote the way Deborah Buran wanted the world to be, I don't think I'd want to live in that world, and I'm Deborah Buran. I embrace the variety of views. I think we think better, we work harder. These are complex issues. There's no one answer. So I want my MAGA friends in Anderson, Indiana, who have very good reason to look back at the old days and say life was better then. I want them at the table with me as we think about what we do going forward. But I think that there are things we can do. Now, here's a place where I both have a little bit of excitement and a little bit of trepidation. Money is changing. So if I'm talking about changing the way asset managers work, and their accountability, we have to think about, well, where is the money coming from? There's a report that came out in September that I had not seen until just this past week, and some of you may already know this. But the assets under management at family offices, that is the private wealth management firms that serve high net worth, really high net worth families, and their family wealth, you put those things together, those amounts will soon be much bigger than hedge funds. Much bigger than hedge funds as a key source of the capital that is going into corporations. Some estimate that that total amount will total $9.5 trillion by 2030. To put it in context, hedge funds today in 2023 held about $4.3 trillion of assets under management. So why am I excited about it? Because I think some of these families do think like me, okay? Why am I scared? Some of them don't.
But some are among the biggest contributors to the Republican Party as
That's
well.
okay. I
So-
want a stronger Republican Party. I just don't want this candidate, okay? Where is this growing the fastest? In North America, in our own backyard. So here's the challenge. These groups, if I want to help shape asset managers and make them more accountable, these groups, it's going to be even darker. There are even less rules in place with how they operate. So I think we've got to lean into some of these issues and say, what kind of world do we want? And I think pushing asset managers of this group, not just the hedge funds. There's been a lot of criticism about hedge funds. I think we've got to look at where the real money is coming now and get in front of that and say, what kind of world do we want to have here? And how do we want to make sure we understand? Because they're not just investing through funds. They're doing direct investments too. They're having real power over corporations. They're saying, you jump this high, I'm going to give you money.
That's all great. I just will say, hedge funds are among the most diverse group of entities, and while the term hedge fund has a very bad connotation, I think there is just so much differentiation among hedge funds that even putting them in one category is at
My
some level
point is just
misleading.
that money is not going to be as important going forward.
But the money that's really important, the big bucks, that's Vanguard, that's Fidelity, that's BlackRock, that's State Street, that's the big, huge mutual fund companies. That's where my pension fund money is. Maybe yours also, maybe it's in TAA. TAA. Well, add TAA to the list. These are the two options for NYU. I'm not disclosing anything personal here. Right? That's where the big, they have, I don't know what the numbers are, you are better with numbers than I am. They are probably have 10 times as much money as the hedge funds do.
I am fine with us getting those groups to be more responsive to me.
Well,
Totally fine.
but
And to you.
Right, they should be responsive to all of us. But you said earlier you have more belief in democracy. How many of you voted in the primaries for your city councillor election in the last primaries? And how many of you did not vote? Okay, so we are focusing on big elections. We are focusing on presidential elections. We are focusing on the Senate. We are focusing on the House of Representatives. I spent a lot of time reading newspapers, especially over the last few weeks. I'm not sure I know the name of my Congress representative. I certainly would have at most a good guess about my representative in the state assembly and in the Senate and in the city council. So these are like, 3, 4, 5, 6 elections. Vanguard votes tens of thousands corporate ballots every year. They have probably about 4,000 US corporations, and for each of them there are probably 10 items. That's 40,000 items. If you invest in one Vanguard fund, that Vanguard fund votes several thousand ballots each year. You don't want to be asked how to vote in each of these ballots. That adds, we can't even handle the 6 or 7 elections in the political system very well. So that's going to get a very, very rough approximation of what our true beliefs are and what our true interests are. We are going to use very rough proxies in deciding how to vote. That's how we already decide how to vote for minor positions. We basically vote based on party affiliation for most minor positions, other than, the top 3 or 4. We barely know the candidates. So democracy has its limitations, and I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that. Let's have people make the important decisions. And then what about the less important decisions? We are kind of stuck between multiple ways of doing so, none of which are really great. Right now, Vanguard doesn't ask me how to vote, they vote. Do I have a lot of confidence that they vote the way I want to vote? Probably they're doing a better than average job, but that may be true for me, may not be true for your interests. How does TIA vote, do you know?
Let me say this. I think if we found ways to make those asset managers be more responsive and listen to us, we're smart, we'll figure out ways to get that information to them. And it may not be person by person, it may be coalitions. It's how we do it in politics. We can do it here too. And again, just because it's hard doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. And I go back to the point, I think we're going to go to Q&A soon. I go back to the point, many of you, most of you, think we cannot solve the problems we're facing today without the active engagement of corporations. So who should we be working with, and what tools should we be reaching out to make sure that the power dynamics within corporations that affect their corporate governance and their behavior take into consideration constituencies that include shareholders but are not limited to shareholders. And that should be just the world we should be working on. Where can we push? There's not a silver bullet. It's not one solution. But it's the aggregation of using all the tools that are available and not throwing our hands up and saying, oh my gosh, it's a mess. How would we do it? We'll figure it out. It's too important not to.
So just one final sentence before we move to the Q&A. Corporations are enormously important economic actors. Obviously, we cannot solve the problems without corporations. The question is, how do we get corporations to do what we as a society want them to do? And I would rely to a much greater extent on the political system and secondarily on consumer power and employee power, rather than what's generally called as the internal affairs of the corporation in order to get corporation to do what they want. So I think we agree on many of the things, except that Deborah sees more promise in internal affairs than I do. I'm a skeptic, you are a believer.
I think that's actually not bad, I will say. Thank you. You got it.
Well, thank you so much for this discussion. We have some time for Q&A. If you've got a question, why don't you line up at the microphones, and we'd love to hear from you.
Is this on? Okay. Hello. So as we're thinking about specifically like shareholder primacy, how do we reckon with several longitudinal studies that have shown that ESG concerns dovetail very well with long-term financial performance? Thank you.
Well, shall I take a
Go ahead.
first crack on that? If ESG concerns dovetail with financial performance, then we live in a happy world where there is shareholder primacy and ESG point in the same direction. There are oodles of studies of ESG, and I don't think the evidence is as clear-cut as you say it is, and you think it is. But last time I looked at it like a year and a half ago. And ESG itself is a term that has many, many different meanings to different people. I like to avoid it because it is even more ambiguous than corporate social responsibility. But if indeed it's true, for example, because of consumer power or employee power, that companies that pursue ESG are making the most money, everybody is in agreement that we should have more ESG. The hard question is if there is a conflict, right? And there's not always going to be an agreement. Certainly at some point, right, there will be a trade-off. Maybe up to some point it's profit maximizing, but after that point, there's going to be a trade-off. So I would not be as Panglossian and saying that actually there is no problem here that we need to solve. I think we have to face it. In fact, there is a problem, and at some point, you will have to sacrifice profits in order to get things going on some other dimensions.
I agree with one small point. You may have to sacrifice short-term profits. Some of these ESG issues can only be advanced with a long-term perspective, and that's what we're arguing about. It's not what's going to happen in my life tomorrow, it's what's going to happen for your children. And so I think you're going to see people taking this longer-term view, and ESG is about long-term value. And so it requires a change in just the horizon in which we're looking.
Let me just say, I really try to avoid the term profits when talking about this, because then people will say, is it short-term profits, is it long-term profits? But from an economic perspective, you can put short-term profits and long-term profits on the same dimension and figure out the net value, right? And and everybody conceptually agrees that that's what should be maximized, right? Yes, sometimes it's good to sacrifice short-term profits for long-term profits, and sometimes it's bad. It depends on how much short-term profits do we sacrifice and how much long-term profits do we get. But I completely agree with you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, if we do adopt some of the mechanisms for like internal corporate ESG, like what we're talking about in most of this conversation, what would be the balancing against actors who are maybe going to use those same mechanisms to try and do some of the more negative things? I know like big one has been like fossil fuels, banks that either want to lend to fossil fuel companies or not. One of those is more traditionally an environmental initiative, but if it's a judgment call, different parties might think about it differently.
I agree, and I think one of the things that I have to keep reminding myself, which I did even here, is that not everyone thinks like me. And so I think when we see some of the anti-ESG proposals coming forward, we see people using the same tools to actually do something that's exactly the opposite of what I had hoped for. But I'm okay with that because one of the things I'm seeing right now, and there's been some interesting litigation that's going on, there's some interesting proxy voting that's going on where you see the anti-ESG views not carrying the day. But I agree that as soon as you start to say we're going to allow this kind of conversation to take place, there are people who have a very different view of what the world should look like, who are going to lean in and say, well, I think it should be this way, and that's maybe not where I would be. So I just want to recognize that that is a risk and it's worth taking.
I have nothing to add.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you again for your time. I just, back to your initial debate about corporate purpose and regulation, how do you think about companies like Tools for Humanity that are, based in both San Francisco and Berlin, and, Sam Altman's out there to build 50,000 orbs to collect iris scans across populations. They've registered 4 million voters. They have over 250 million in investments now. There's regulatory actions, mostly driven by EU countries. I think Spain started it, and then Germany, Argentina, and Kenya have launched criminal investigations. They've obviously not rolled out their orbs and WorldCoin associated with that in more developed countries, but there's huge data privacy issues implicated, and there's a lot of variation across countries and sort of digital literacy among those populations, which call for coordinated global regulatory action. So how do you think about that difference?
First, let me just say thank you for that question, because we've been very US-centric in this conversation. And we're talking about multinational corporations. And so one of the things that I think we are struggling with, and your example is a good example of this, is when you have different systems in place. The Europeans are ahead of us in some ways. They have a different view of the role of corporations in society, I say to the European next to me. But so I think that I think we have to, at some level, I'm dodging your question, but I think you're making a really important point that I wanted to make sure we had here, which is we're not operating alone. We're operating in concert with all sorts of governments that are trying to make these decisions and may have more influence over the corporations we're talking about right now than the US ever will have, because we're much more laissez-faire.
Well, I agree to some extent, and our different laissez-fairness is a reflection of the different politics within the United States compared to Europe. So Europe has always been, or for a long time been, much more regulatorily oriented and more willing to limit the power of corporations, and they have different rules, and the companies operate in these different rules. But even though we have multinational corporations, regarding the rights of shareholders and the power structure within the corporation, that's determined by the jurisdiction in which a corporation is organized. But as to other kinds of laws, like rights of employees, environmental laws, that's determined by the jurisdiction in which the corporation operates. So I think that's one other reason why I think changing the laws that are determined by where a corporation operates is the strategically better way to create social change than by looking at the laws that determine the internal affairs of the corporation.
Thank you. A few years ago, BlackRock implemented a policy of so-called proxy choice, allowing certain institutional investors to have input along more like liberal or conservative dimensions on how they wanted their proxies voted. And I'm curious about your thoughts on policies like this that keep that input within institutions and thereby blocking individual like Main Street investor voice, but also kind of the concerns where institutional clients that are foreign may have input in this kind of domestic democratic process.
I think that's a great question, and like the question is of a general form, like to what extent should asset managers like BlackRock vote the shares that they are managing in the way they see fit, or to what extent should they ask the investors, like Deborah and me, how to vote these shares? And I see pluses and minuses. So in principle, there's absolutely nothing wrong, and in fact very desirable for them to ask us, because it's our money, it's not their money. So we should determine how they're going to vote the shares. In practice, it generates two problems. One is that if many shareholders have absolutely no interest and no knowledge about what kind of directions to give. So the other problem is that entities like BlackRock have been doing over the last 20, 30 years a pretty good job is too much to say. The beginning of an effort in constraining management. And again, I say it now for the third time. These are the real powerful people in America, the managers of the top corporations. And they have a lot of discretion and relatively little accountability. So I see BlackRock and Vanguard and TAA as entities that can create some counterbalance and some accountability for management. And from BlackRock and Vanguard and TAA, to be able to do that, they have to vote their shares in a kind of unified fashion. If BlackRock says, look, actually, we have no power over the way we're going to vote the shares, that's up to Deborah and Jeannie and Marcel and all of you. But we would like you managers to do X, Y, and Z. Managers are going to say, well, why should I care what you want me to do? You have no voting power. You run an index fund, so you have no investment power. You have absolutely power of no sort whatsoever. So thank you for your call. Next question. And that is a downside in doing that. So there is an upside and there is a downside. It's not clear to me how the optimal balance should be struck.
Well, we're about to run out of time, so why don't we just take the two last questions together and then react to them and we'll close.
Yeah, I was just curious if you could speak a bit on the public policy, responsible public policy engagement part of CSR. And I think about that, of course, in terms of the SEC rule that we discussed, but also the California climate disclosure rule, in which corporations were very involved in the passage of that, and even the EU regulation, because it seems to me that CSR and sort of a legislative or regulatory approach to something like an environmental or climate problem are not necessarily distinct, right? And part of CSR is sort of the role of corporations in engaging in sort of like the Inflation Reduction Act or any of the other examples I've provided. So I was just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and very briefly, thank you. I was just wondering, because legislation has been discussed kind of as a starting point, whether there is any acknowledgement of the influence of corporations through lobbying to form policy and form legislation, and whether they have any responsibilities when they're doing that.
I think we need another hour.
Yes. This is just an advertisement also to take their courses. You'll learn and discuss a lot more along these lines if you do.
I'm not sure where to start with this one. Marcel, do you have some thoughts? I might take a pause.
Well, no, corporate lobbying is a complicated topic, right? Because there is the danger that the managers are using well, first of all, corporations do not make a lot of donations to political parties. I believe they are prohibited from doing so. They are doing it through special vehicles that don't really use the corporation's money. Corporations obviously engage in a lot of lobbying other than through making political donations, mostly through the trade organizations, except if they are like very, very big organizations. And no, there is a conflict of interest. There are corporations in doing the lobbying, really doing the kind of lobbying that we want to do. So that is a potential concern here. We may not always agree with the corporate lobbying activities, just like we don't agree always with the corporations' environmental operations and the other operations.
You know, and I guess maybe that's just shortly, because I know that's maybe where your two questions actually come together, right? So it's not as disseparate. Thank you for giving me time to gather my thoughts, which is corporations are part of our society, and they are shaping some of these legislative initiatives, for good or for ill, in their interest. And I think that, again, It's just one more reason, so I'm going to just keep going back to why it matters to me how corporations have power and who controls the corporations, because they have these influences. Yes, there's some boundaries, maybe not as much as we would hope. On the other hand, you sometimes see corporations, as you were giving examples, of actually getting very involved. And so I think, again, this is just one more place where we say we cannot live in a world where we think that only human beings are making decisions. And we have to recognize that these institutions are making decisions. The people at the top, those important people you keep talking about, are making these decisions. But at the end of the day, we have to find a way to connect and to be communicating and to be responding to what's going on.
Let me just say, I agree and I disagree, is that no, institutions do not make decisions. It's the people at the top of these institutions that makes these decisions.
Okay, I agree with that.
And what I know you do, but I wanted to rephrase it.
Thank you.
And like a lot of what corporate law is about, what you learn if you take a class in corporations, is how do we make sure, or what can we do to improve the structure so that the people on top of the corporations are making decisions that are in the social interests, right? And social interest can be shareholders' interest, can be broader than shareholders' interest, but social interest is most certainly not the personal interest of the people who stand on top of the corporations. That's definitely not the kind of interest that we are trying to further, but those people have a lot of power and they need constraints and they need accountability. And on some level, and I think
That's what I've been saying
I
for
know.
the past hour.
on some level, right, there is going to be a trade-off between creating constraints and accountability on one hand and making sure that they are taking account of perhaps a broader social interest than shareholders' interest on one way. I'm leaning towards the direction of make sure that they are doing what's in the shareholders' interest and have accountability. And I don't want to characterize what you are saying, but like I think you are leaning a little bit more in the direction of let's make sure that they're taking account of social interest, even possibly at the expense of reducing accountability and constraints. But maybe that's not your position. I don't want to speak for you for a second time.
Well, thank you so much for coming today. Please join me in thanking Deborah and Marcel. Thank you.